The fluorescent lights in the intensive care unit don't just shine, they hum. It's a low, persistent vibration that crawls under your skin and settles in the marrow of your bones. I lay there for 3 days, my world reduced to the rhythmic, mechanical chirp of a heart monitor and the smell of industrial-grade disinfectant. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. My chest was a cage of bruised ribs and a heart that had decided, quite suddenly, that 35 years of city planning and 3 years of domestic stress were enough to warrant a total shutdown. I was 64 years old, a man who had spent his life meticulously mapping out the traffic flow and structural integrity of Portland, Oregon. I knew how to fix a failing intersection. I knew how to preserve a historic facade, but as I stared at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling, I realized I had no idea how to fix the structural rot in my own family. My phone, resting on the adjustable metal tray, began to vibrate. The screen lit up with a photo I hadn't changed in years. Jennifer at 22, glowing in her graduation gown. My thumb hovered over the glass. My hand was shaking, a side effect of the medication or the fear, I wasn't sure. I answered on the 3rd ring, my voice coming out as a dry, jagged rasp. "Hello? Dad." Finally. Jennifer's voice didn't carry the softness of a daughter worried about her father's survival. It was tight, impatient, vibrating with the kind of stress that comes from a self-inflicted schedule. "Listen, tomorrow is Brian's 35th birthday. I've been trying to get a hold of you for hours. We're doing the big garden party, remember? The one we talked about last month." I closed my eyes. A sharp pang flared behind my sternum. "Jennifer, I can't. I'm still in the hospital. I'm in the ICU." "Again with the hospital?" She let out a sharp, theatrical sigh that felt like a slap across my face. "Dad, we have 40 people coming. The caterer is already asking where to set up the warming stations, and the tent company needs someone to show them where the underground sprinkler lines are so they don't puncture them. I can't do everything myself. Brian is busy with his new consulting leads." In the background, I heard the muffled, arrogant baritone of my son-in-law. "Tell him we need the good teak chairs from the garage, Jen, and tell him to make sure the lawn is mowed before the guests arrive." I swallowed hard, the plastic oxygen cannula pinching the skin under my nose. "Jennifer, listen to me. I had a heart attack, a real one. They had to stabilize me in the ER. I'm hooked up to 3 different machines right now." There was a pause. For a fleeting second, I thought the gravity of the situation might finally break through the wall of her entitlement. I thought she might ask if I was okay, or which hospital I was in, or if she should bring me a change of clothes. "You're always so dramatic when things aren't about you," she said, her voice turning to ice. "Brian's mother is flying in from Chicago. This party is important for his networking. If you're really going to be this selfish and hide out in a hospital bed just to get out of helping your own daughter, then don't bother coming home at all. We don't need someone who isn't a team player. If you can't be there for family when it matters, then maybe you shouldn't be part of this family." The line went dead. I stared at the phone until the screen timed out, leaving me in the dim, blue-tinged shadows of the room. The silence that followed was heavier than the machines. Don't bother coming home. It was my house, my craftsman-style home on S.E. Ankeny Street, that I'd bought with my late wife in Mukngin Chinchum Chinwitam. The house I'd spent 20 years meticulously maintaining. The house I'd opened up to them 3 years ago, when they showed up on my doorstep with 17 boxes and a 6-month plan to get back on their feet. I looked at the heart monitor. My pulse was climbing. The team player she wanted was a servant who paid the bills and kept the gears turning while they played at being lifestyle entrepreneurs. A nurse came in, a woman named Patricia, who had seen me at my worst over the last 72 hours. She checked my IV bag and then looked at the monitor. She saw my face and stopped what she was doing. "Mr. Bishop, your heart rate is spiking. Are you in pain?" "Not the kind you can treat with a drip, Patricia," I whispered. "Family?" she asked, her voice softening. I suppose she saw this often, the way the people who are supposed to love you can become the most dangerous thing for your health. "Something like that," I said. I reached for my phone. My finger didn't hesitate this time. I opened Jennifer's contact info and I pressed block. Then I did the same for Brian. A strange, cold calm washed over me. It was the feeling of a blueprint finally clicking into place. For 3 years, I had been the passive victim of their temporary stay. I had watched them transform my workshop into a home gym they never used. I had watched them rack up debt on my credit cards and treat my kitchen like a 5-star restaurant where the bill never came. I was a city planner, I knew how to identify a structure that was no longer sound. And I knew exactly what you had to do with a building that was too far gone to be saved. You had to clear the site and start over. The next afternoon, the door to my room opened, and Clarence Adams walked in. Clarence was my neighbor of 20 years and a retired real estate attorney. He was carrying a paper cup of coffee that smelled like heaven and a manila folder that looked like trouble. He sat down in the vinyl visitor's chair, his expression uncharacteristically grim. "You look like you've been through a meat grinder, Vernon," he said, handing me the coffee. "I feel like it. Thanks for coming, Clarence. I need a favor." I figured, but before we get to that, there's something you need to see. He opened the folder. "I didn't want to tell you this while you were still in the red zone, but I saw Jennifer and Brian at New Seasons yesterday. They were loading a cart with prime rib and Moet. I asked how you were doing. Jennifer told me you were away on a business retreat and shouldn't be disturbed." My grip tightened on the coffee cup. "A business retreat? That's not the worst of it, Vernon." Clarence leaned in, his voice dropping. "I've been watching the house while you've been in here. A black Lexus RX Bachamnamui showed up in your driveway 4 days ago. New tags. And last night, I saw them hauling your old mahogany dining set out to the curb. They've been replacing your furniture, Vernon. It looks like they're redecorating the whole main floor. The business retreat was my stay in the ICU. They were using my absence, my potential death, to renovate my home for a birthday party. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were moving on, as if I already had. They're also talking to people, Vernon," Clarence continued. "I heard them speaking with a contractor on the porch. Brian was talking about opening up the floor plan and removing that load-bearing wall. He was telling the guy he was the owner of the property." A surge of adrenaline hit me, sharper than any medication. My mind, usually so focused on the orderly growth of a city, began to map out a different kind of project. This wasn't about traffic flow or zoning anymore. This was about survival. "Clarence," I said, my voice steady for the first time since the attack, "how quickly can you get me a full title search and a credit report on my own address?" He raised an eyebrow. "In this county, a few hours if I pull some strings." "Why? You think they're doing more than just moving furniture?" "I think they've forgotten whose name is on the deed," I said. "And I think it's time I reminded them. But I need to know the depth of the rot first. I need to know everything they've done while I was lying here." Clarence nodded, his lawyer brain already spinning. "I'll get on it. But Vernon, you're still recovering. The doctor said another week." "I'll stay the week," I said, looking out the window at the distant Portland skyline. "It'll give me plenty of time to plan, because when I walk through that front door, I'm not coming back as a father, I'm coming back as a landlord." Clarence left, and I was alone again with the hum of the ICU. But the sound didn't irritate me anymore. It sounded like a countdown. 3 days later, Clarence returned. He didn't bring coffee this time. He brought a stack of documents that felt like a death warrant. He didn't sit down. He paced the small room, his jaw set. "Vernon, it's bad. It's worse than we thought." He dropped a document onto my lap. It was a loan application from KeyBank. My name was at the top, but the signature at the bottom was a jagged, ugly imitation of my own. "They didn't just buy a car, Vernon," Clarence whispered. "They tried to refinance the house. They were trying to pull hung in equity out of your property while you were in here fighting for your life. The bank flagged it for documentation irregularities, but they haven't denied it yet. They're waiting for the owner to come in and verify the signature." The room seemed to tilt. My own daughter, my own flesh and blood had stood over my empty bed, or perhaps even sat in my house while I was being resuscitated and tried to steal the roof over my head. "There's more," Clarence said, his voice trembling with anger. "I checked the public records. Brian has 3 outstanding judgments against him for failed business ventures. He's underwater to the tune of $250,000. The Lexus? It's not a purchase. It's a high-interest lease they've already missed the first payment on." I looked at the forged signature. The loops of the V were too wide. The B was shaky. It was a desperate, amateurish attempt to erase me. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I felt a cold, crystalline focus settle over me. I had spent 35 years ensuring that things were built to code, that foundations were solid, that the rules were followed. And when the rules were broken, there were always consequences. "Clarence," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "I want you to prepare 3 things. First, a 90-day notice to quit. Second, a formal report for the white-collar crime division of the Portland PD regarding the forgery. And third, I want you to find me the meanest, most efficient estate liquidator in the Pacific Northwest. Clarence stared at me. Vernon, you're talking about sending your daughter to prison. I looked at the heart monitor, the steady, unwavering line of my life continuing despite her best efforts. No, Clarence, I said. I'm talking about a total demolition. They wanted me to stay away from my own home? Fine. I'll give them exactly what they asked for. But they aren't going to like what's left of the neighborhood when I'm done. I lay back against the pillows, my heart beating with a new, dark purpose. I didn't know it yet, but the man who had walked into this hospital was dead. The man who was leaving was someone they didn't recognize, a man who was about to turn their perfect life into a living nightmare. The 4 days following Clarence's visit were the longest of my life. In the quiet of the cardiac ward, removed from the daily hum of my own home, the memories I had suppressed for 3 years began to resurface with agonizing clarity. I had plenty of time to perform a forensic audit of my own failures as a father. I wasn't just a victim of their greed, I was the architect of my own obsolescence. I had let them in. I had handed them the keys, the credit cards, and the benefit of every doubt until there was nothing left of the man I used to be. I thought back to the rainy Tuesday 3 years ago when they first arrived. Jennifer had looked so small, her eyes red from crying, standing on the porch of the house I'd built with her mother. She told me Brian's investors had pulled out of his tech startup, a disruptive digital marketing firm that, in hindsight, was just a fancy name for a website that didn't sell anything. They needed a place to stay for 6 months, she said, just until the next round of funding came through. I remember the surge of protective instinct I felt. My wife had been gone for 5 years, and the house felt cavernous and cold. Having my daughter back felt like a second chance at being a family. I'd spent the first weekend clearing out my workshop in the garage, a space where I'd restored antique furniture for decades to make room for Brian's professional gym equipment. He'd insisted. He couldn't function without a high-performance fitness routine. I should have seen it then the way he looked at my tools, my lathe, my collection of vintage hand planes, as if they were just clutter in the way of his ego. Within a month, my workshop was gone, replaced by a squat rack and a row of dumbbells that eventually did nothing but collect dust, while Brian spent his afternoons on my sofa, networking on his laptop while drinking my 20-year-old scotch. The erosion happened in inches. First, it was the suggested upgrades. Jennifer convinced me the kitchen was dated, and before I knew it, I was cutting a check for $8,000 for Italian marble countertops she insisted were necessary for the image they needed to project. Then it was the bills. Brian offered to take the stress off me by managing the household accounts. What he actually did was intercept the mail, hiding the credit card statements that were ballooning with charges for designer clothes, high-end skincare, and business dinners at the most expensive restaurants in the Pearl District. I sat in that hospital bed, my chest still aching, and realized that for 3 years I had been paying for my own disappearance. They had slowly boxed up my life, piece by piece, and moved it into the attic of my own mind. They made me feel like an intruder in my own hallways. If I complained about the noise from Brian's late-night gaming sessions, Jennifer would look at me with practiced pity and ask if I was feeling confused or if my nerves were acting up again. They were gaslighting me into a state of early-onset helplessness, all while they lived like royalty on a civil servant's pension. On the morning of my discharge, Dr. Patel came in to give me the final talk. He looked at my charts and then at me, his eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. Physically, Mr. Bishop, your heart is stable, but your stress levels are through the roof. If you go back to whatever environment caused this, you won't make it to Christmas. You need peace. You need a controlled environment. Do you have someone at home who can provide that? I looked at the discharge papers. I thought about the forged signatures and the business retreat lie. I thought about the black Lexus sitting in my driveway, fueled by equity they had tried to steal from the very walls that protected them. I have exactly what I need, doctor, I said. I'm going to take total control of my environment. Clarence picked me up at noon. He didn't say much as we drove through the familiar, tree-lined streets of Laurelhurst. He knew I was in a fragile state, but he also knew the look in my eyes. It was the same look I used to get when a developer tried to cut corners on a historic preservation project. It was the look of a man who was about to enforce the code to the very last decimal point. As we turned the corner onto Ankeny Street, my heart did a strange, Fluttering hitch, not a medical one, but a visceral reaction to the sight of my own home. The black Lexus was there, gleaming in the sun like a predatory insect. The lawn, which I had spent 20 years manicuring, was overgrown and littered with empty delivery boxes. But it was the front window that stopped my breath. My wife's favorite stained glass lamp, a piece we'd bought on our honeymoon in Victoria, was gone. In its place was a neon sign that read, "Stay humble, hustle hard." "They've turned your house into a frat house for failed entrepreneurs, Vernon," Clarence whispered, pulling the car to a stop. "Are you sure you want to go in there alone? I can stay." "No," I said, unbuckling my seatbelt. My legs felt heavy, but my mind was a sharp, cold blade. "I need to see the full extent of the damage myself. Just have the papers ready, Clarence. When I call, I want you to move fast." I walked up the path, each step a conscious effort. I didn't use my key. I wanted to see if they'd changed the locks. To my surprise, the door opened easily. The air inside didn't smell like home. It didn't smell like the beeswax and cedar I'd used for decades. It smelled like expensive cologne, stale takeout, and desperation. The living room was unrecognizable. My mahogany dining set, the one I'd built myself, the one where Jennifer had done her homework for 12 years, was nowhere to be seen. In its place was a sprawling, charcoal gray sectional sofa that looked like it cost more than my first car. A 75-inch television was mounted on the wall, wires hanging haphazardly like exposed veins. I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. Brian's voice, loud and boastful. "I'm telling you, once the refi clears, we're looking at the property in Bend. We can flip this place for a fortune once the old man is, well, you know. He's not exactly a long-term tenant anymore." "Brian, stop." Jennifer's voice was lower, but there was no reprimand in it, only a nervous curiosity. "We have to be careful with the paperwork. The bank said they needed a signature verification." "I'll handle it," Brian snapped. "I've got his handwriting down. Besides, the guy is barely conscious half the time. He won't even know what he's signing when I bring the insurance papers to his bedside." I stood in the shadows of the hallway, feeling the coldness of the ICU settle back into my bones. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was the silence before a demolition. They were talking about me as if I were a ghost, a minor hurdle in their quest for a lifestyle they hadn't earned. I stepped into the kitchen. The silence that followed was so sudden it was physical. Brian was leaning against the marble countertop I'd paid for, a bottle of imported beer in his hand. Jennifer was sitting at the breakfast bar, her laptop open to a real estate listing. "Dad?" Jennifer's face went a shade of pale I'd never seen. What are you doing here?" "The hospital said you'd be there for another week." "The hospital said a lot of things," I said, my voice low and steady. I didn't look at her. I looked at the kitchen. They had replaced my vintage stove with a high-end professional range that looked like it had never seen a home-cooked meal. They said I needed to be in a stress-free environment. They said I needed to be around people who cared about my recovery. Brian recovered first, a greasy smile sliding onto his face. "Hey, Big V, you're looking. Well, you're back. We were just, getting the place ready for your homecoming. We wanted it to be a surprise." "I'm surprised, Brian," I said. I walked over to the counter and picked up a piece of mail that was sitting by the sink. It was a notice from a collection agency addressed to Brian Parker. "I'm surprised the house is still standing with the amount of debt you've brought into it." Brian's smile flickered. "Now look, Vernon, don't get worked up. It's not good for your heart. We've got everything under control. We're just in a transitional phase." "A transitional phase," I repeated. I turned to Jennifer. "Where is your mother's dining table, Jennifer?" She looked away, her fingers twitching on the laptop keys. It was taking up so much space, Dad. It didn't fit the new aesthetic. We put it in the garage. Well, Brian might have sold it to a boutique on Hawthorne to cover the deposit on the new sofa. I felt a sharp, hot needle of pain in my chest. Not a heart attack, pure, unadulterated rage. That table was the only thing I had left of her mother's daily presence. "You sold it," I whispered. "It was an executive decision, Vernon." Brian stepped forward, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "The old stuff was dragging down the property value. We're modernizing. We're looking at the big picture. You should be thanking us." I looked at the man who had infiltrated my life, who had turned my daughter into a co-conspirator in her own father's erasure. He was soft, arrogant, and entirely convinced of his own brilliance. He had no idea who he was talking to. He thought I was just an old man with a failing heart. He didn't know that I had spent 30 years navigating the shark-infested waters of city politics. He didn't know that I had personally overseen the eviction of 3 different corrupt construction firms. He didn't know that I had spent the last 72 hours building a case that would strip him of everything he thought he had stolen. "You're right, Brian," I said, forcing a calm that seemed to unnerve him. "The old stuff was dragging things down. It's time for a change, a big one. See, I knew you'd get it." Brian relaxed, taking a long pull of his beer. "We can talk about the details tomorrow. You look tired. Why don't you go up to the guest room and get some rest? I've moved some of your boxes in there to make things easier." "The guest room, in my own house." "I'll do that," I said. "But before I go, Brian, I noticed the Lexus in the driveway. Nice car." "Yeah," he grinned, his chest puffing out. "It's all about the brand, you know. Can't show up to consulting gigs in a 10-year-old Subaru." "I agree," I said. "It's all about the brand, and I think your brand is about to become very, very famous." I walked toward the stairs, my hand gripping the banister. My heart was steady. The hum of the ICU was gone, replaced by the mechanical precision of a plan in motion. "What does that mean?" Jennifer called after me, her voice tinged with the first notes of real alarm. I didn't answer. I went into the guest room, a cramped space, filled with the boxes of my life, my awards shoved into corners, my wife's photos face down on the floor. I sat on the edge of the twin bed and pulled out my phone. I unblocked Clarence. "Move," I texted. Then I leaned back and waited for the sound of the first domino to fall. I didn't know yet how far they were willing to go to protect their lies, but I was about to find out. Because as I sat in the dark, I realized something Brian had overlooked. In his haste to refinance the house, he'd used a digital notary service that required a secondary contact for verification. And that secondary contact, it wasn't Jennifer. It was an old email address of mine that they thought I'd stopped using years ago. The bank hadn't just flagged the signature. They had sent me a copy of the entire application, including the list of assets Brian had claimed as his own. What I saw on that list made my blood turn to ice. He hadn't just tried to steal the house. He had listed my entire retirement portfolio as his personal collateral. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively trying to bankrupt me before I could. I sat there in the silence of my stolen home, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel old. I felt dangerous. What happened next changed everything, because at home a.m., I heard the front door creak open and the sound of muffled voices that didn't belong to my daughter or her husband. The floorboards in a house built in what Ngin Jinchum Haimui Lum aren't just wood, they're a nervous system. I knew every creak, every groan, every sigh of that craftsman. I knew the specific high-pitched whine the third step made and the dull thud of the floor in the foyer. So, when the front door opened at home a.m., I didn't need to see the intruders to know that they weren't Jennifer or Brian. Brian walked like he owned the world, heavy-heeled and arrogant. Jennifer walked with the frantic, clicking pace of someone perpetually late. These footsteps were different. They were light, rhythmic, and purposeful. I sat up in the twin bed in the guest room, my heart doing that familiar, jagged dance in my chest. I reached for the nitroglycerin tabs on the nightstand, my fingers trembling as I unscrewed the cap. I wasn't just a sick old man anymore. I was a man living in occupied territory. I slipped a pill under my tongue and waited for the chemical bloom to widen my arteries. Then, I stood up. I didn't turn on a light. I navigated by the silver moonlight filtering through the dusty blinds, moving toward the door. I cracked it just an inch. Below me, in the foyer, the low murmur of voices drifted up. "I told you, he's in the hospital," a voice whispered. It was Brian, but his tone was different, stripped of the swagger he used with me. He sounded small, hunted. "He's not going to be back for at least another week. We have the run of the place." "He's back, Brian." This voice was new. It was cold, gravelly, and carried the weight of someone who didn't take excuses for currency. "We saw the Subaru next door. We saw the lights. You told us the old man was a non-factor. You told us the title was already in your name." "It's a formality." Brian's voice rose in a panicked squeak before he muffled it. "The paperwork is at the bank. It's a done deal. I just need a little more time to finalize the equity transfer. The party tomorrow. It's all about the investors. Once they see the house, once they see the lifestyle, the funding for the Portland project is guaranteed. We don't care about your lifestyle, Parker. the gravelly voice said. I heard the distinct snick of a lighter. We care about the $60,000 you owe for the equipment lease. And we care about the fact that the address you gave us for collateral belongs to a man who is currently sleeping upstairs and very much alive. I felt the blood drain from my face. Brian hadn't just tried to refinance the house. He'd used it as a dummy address for a predatory equipment lease, probably for his failed lifestyle gym venture. He was selling my house to 2 different sets of sharks at the same time. I gripped the doorframe, my knuckles white. I looked around the guest room. This was where they'd shoved me, the non-factor. I looked at the boxes stacked against the wall. One of them was open. Inside was my collection of vintage fountain pens, things I'd collected over 40 years of planning. They were gone. The velvet-lined slots were empty. Brian hadn't just sold the dining table. He was picking the carcass of my life clean while I was still breathing. Listen, Brian hissed downstairs. Just give me the weekend. After the party, I'll have the signatures. I'll have the cash. Just don't make a scene. My wife doesn't know the full extent of the bridge loan. Your wife? The gravelly voice laughed, a dry, rattling sound. She's the one who signed the secondary guarantor forms, Brian. She knows exactly what's happening. Or maybe she's just as good a liar as you are. The silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer knew? My little girl, the one I'd taught to ride a bike on this very street, the one I'd stayed up with during every fever and every heartbreak. She had signed off on my ruin. I retreated from the door, my breath coming in shallow hitches. I sat back down on the bed, the darkness of the room pressing in on me. I thought back to when the rot had truly set in. Maybe it wasn't 3 years ago. Maybe it was when I first started paying her credit cards in college. Maybe it was when I let Brian talk me into investing in his first 3 failed businesses because I didn't want to see my daughter suffer. I had raised a predator by being a provider, and now the wolf was at the door, and he brought friends. The voices downstairs faded as they moved into the kitchen. I heard the back door close. Then, the heavy, rhythmic thud of Brian walking toward his my bedroom. I didn't sleep. I sat in that chair until the sun began to bleed through the clouds, turning the Portland sky a bruised shade of purple. At bay, home a.m., the house erupted into a different kind of chaos. Dad, you up? Jennifer's voice was bright, artificial. She didn't wait for an answer before pushing the door open. She was already dressed in a crisp, white linen suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She looked radiant, except for the slight puffiness around her eyes that spoke of a long night. We've got a big day, Dad, she chirped, stepping over a box of my old books as if it were trash. The caterers will be here at 10. I need you to stay out of the kitchen. And Brian needs the garage cleared out. He's setting up a VIP lounge for some of his partners. I looked at her. Really looked at her. I saw the girl I'd raised, but I also saw the woman who had signed a secondary guarantor form on her father's life. The garage? I asked, my voice gravelly. Where are my tools, Jennifer? The lathe? The workbench? She waved a hand dismissively. We had to move all that old junk, Dad. It was a fire hazard. Brian called a junk removal service last week. They took it all to the donation center. It's for the best, really. You haven't used that stuff in years. The donation center. My grandfather's hand planes. The lathe I'd used to turn the spindles for the very stairs she had just climbed. Gone. I use those tools every Sunday, Jennifer, I said quietly. Well, things change, she said, her tone sharpening. She was losing patience with the non-factor. Look, just stay in here or go for a walk. We need the house to look aspirational, not like a retirement home. Oh, and Brian said to remind you, if any of his friends ask, you're staying with us to help with the transition into your new condo. My new condo? The one we're looking at in Beaverton, she said, not even blinking. The assisted living community. It's got a great garden, Dad. You'll love it. We're going to talk about it more after the party. She turned and left, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering in the air like an insult. Assisted living. In Beaverton. 20 miles away from the life I'd built. They weren't just taking the house. They were deporting me. I stood up and walked to the window. I saw the caterers arriving, their white vans clogging the narrow street. I saw Brian on the lawn, wearing a headset, directing people like he was a movie producer. He looked like a man who had already won. I pulled out my phone and checked my messages. One from Clarence. The title search is back. You were right. There's a lien on the property from a private equity firm. They used a power of attorney form with your forged signature. Vernon, This is high-level fraud. I've contacted a friend in the DA's office. They want to talk. But more importantly, the estate liquidator is on standby. Say the word. I looked down at the lawn. Brian was laughing, shaking hands with a man in a sharp suit. They were standing right over the spot where I'd buried our family dog 10 years ago. I typed back a single word. Execute. For the next 4 hours, I played the part. I became the invisible man. I moved through the house, watching the transformation. They had covered my walls with modern, soulless art. They had replaced my rugs with cold, industrial gray carpet. They were erasing the history of the Bishop family and replacing it with a lifestyle brand built on air and theft. At noon, the first guests began to arrive. These weren't friends, they were props. Young, hungry-looking people in fast-fashion suits, carrying business cards, and drinking my expensive wine. Brian was in his element, holding court in the VIP lounge, my former workshop. It's all about the synergy of the space, I heard him telling a group of rapt listeners. My father-in-law was a great steward of the property, but he recognizes that the next generation needs a different kind of infrastructure. We're going to be the hub of the new Portland tech scene right here. I stood in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. A young woman in a yellow dress walked in and looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. "Are you the help?" she asked. "I'm the owner," I said. She laughed, a tinkling, condescending sound. "Oh, you must be Jennifer's dad. She said you have a great sense of humor. The condo in Beaverton sounds lovely, by the way. My grandmother is in a similar place. They have bingo every Tuesday." I smiled at her. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had spent 30 years watching buildings fall exactly where he told them to. "I'm sure it's wonderful, but I think there's been a change in the plans." I walked out of the kitchen and toward the front door. The party was in full swing. The music was a low, thumping bass that made the windows rattle. Jennifer was at the center of a circle of women, showing off a new diamond tennis bracelet, another investment, no doubt. I stepped out onto the porch. The air was hot and stagnant. A large black SUV pulled up to the curb, not the Lexus. This was a heavy, nondescript vehicle with tinted windows. Behind it, a flatbed tow truck with the name Apex Recovery emblazoned on the side. A man in a navy suit stepped out of the SUV. He looked like Clarence, but harder. This was Miller, the liquidator. He walked up the path, ignoring the guests who were spilling out onto the lawn with their wine glasses. "Vernon Bishop," he asked. "That's me. I have the court-authorized emergency injunction," he said, handing me a folder, "and the repossession orders for all assets purchased under the fraudulent accounts. Do you want me to wait until the party is over?" I looked at Brian, who was currently laughing at something a tall man in a vest was saying. Brian looked up and saw Miller. His smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. "No," I said, my voice carrying over the music as I signaled to the caterers to kill the sound. "I think the timing is perfect. People should see how a lifestyle brand actually works." I walked back into the house, Miller and 2 large men in uniform following close behind. The music died. The room went silent, save for the hum of the air conditioner. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward me. "Dad, what are you doing?" Jennifer hurried over, her face a mask of social terror. "Who are these people? We're in the middle of a toast." "The toast is over, Jennifer," I said. I looked at Brian, who was frozen in the doorway of the VIP lounge. Miller stepped forward, his voice projected with professional coldness. "My name is Arthur Miller. I am an agent for the estate of Vernon Bishop. Under the emergency injunction issued this morning by the Multnomah County Circuit Court, this property is being secured. All individuals not named on the original deed have 60 minutes to remove their personal belongings. Anything left behind will be considered abandoned and sold to satisfy outstanding debts." "Wait, what?" Brian stammered, stepping forward. "That's impossible. I have the paperwork. I'm the—" "You're a forger, Brian," Miller said, handing him a copy of the police report Clarence had filed. "And the bank has already reversed the equity draw. They're calling the loan due immediately, which means the Lexus in the driveway. It's being hooked up to that tow truck right now." Through the window, the sound of the tow truck's hydraulic lift hissed. The guests began to murmur, the synergy of the room collapsing into panicked whispers. "Dad, please." Jennifer grabbed my arm. "You're embarrassing us. We can talk about this." "We did talk, Jennifer," I said gently but firmly, removing her hand. "We talked when I was in the ICU and you told me not to come home. So I didn't come home to my daughter. I came home to a crime scene." I turned to the guests, my voice steady and clear. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, everyone, but the business retreat is over. If you value your reputations, I suggest you leave now, before the police arrive to take a formal statement regarding the unauthorized use of this property. The exodus was fast. People scrambled for their bags, avoiding eye contact with Brian and Jennifer as they fled toward the street. The lifestyle was vanishing in a cloud of dust and shame. But as the last guest left, Brian's face shifted. The fear was gone, replaced by a desperate, animalistic rage. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. He looked like a man who had nothing left to lose. "You think you can just kick us out?" he hissed, stepping toward me. "I've spent 3 years building this. I've put everything into this house. You're an old man with one foot in the grave, Vernon. You think you're going to survive this?" He lunged. But Brian had forgotten one thing. I was a city planner. I always had a contingency for a structural failure. What happened next changed the course of the entire evening, and it started with a sound from the basement that made the entire house shudder. Brian didn't lunge like a man who knew how to fight. He lunged like a man who had spent his life getting what he wanted through tantrums and slick talk, only to find himself suddenly bankrupt of both. He was clumsy, a frantic burst of soft muscle and expensive cologne, but he never reached me. Hicks, the larger of the 2 men Miller had brought along, stepped into the gap with the practiced grace of a professional. He didn't hit Brian. He simply caught him by the shoulders and redirected that desperate momentum into the edge of the new, charcoal gray sectional. Brian hit the cushions with a dull thud, looking less like a disruptive entrepreneur and more like a child who had tripped on the playground. "Careful, Mr. Parker," Miller said, his voice as dry as parchment. "Assaulting the homeowner during a legal seizure usually complicates the bail hearing." But the threat was drowned out by the sound from below. It wasn't just a shudder. It was a rhythmic, metallic banging that vibrated through the floorboards, followed by the unmistakable, violent sound of rushing water. It sounded like a dam had burst directly under my feet. "The main line," I whispered, the city planner in me reacting before the father did. "Brian, what did you do to the basement?" Brian sat on the sofa, his face a mask of sweating, pale terror. He didn't answer. He just stared at the ceiling. I followed his gaze and felt my heart hitch. A dark, damp circle was already forming on the pristine white plaster above the 75-inch television, the very room Brian had bragged about modernizing. The water wasn't just leaking. It was tea-colored and thick, and it smelled like a sewer. "The master suite renovation," Jennifer gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Brian, you said you handled the plumbing yourself to save the contractor fees. You said you watched a video." "It was a simple bypass," Brian yelled, scrambling off the sofa as a heavy drop of sludge landed on his white linen shirt. "I just needed to move the stack to accommodate the rainfall shower head. It was supposed to hold." I watched, paralyzed by a mixture of horror and a dark, twisted sense of vindication as the ceiling of my beautiful craftsman home began to sag. It was a perfect metaphor for everything they had built over the last 3 years, a high-end facade held together by spit, ego, and gross incompetence. "Hicks, shut off the main at the curb," I barked. The old Vernon was back, the one who had managed a 100-man crew at the Department of Public Works. "Miller, call the emergency plumbers on the list I gave you, and someone get that television off the wall before it turns into a lightning rod." The next 20 minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. The water was shut off, but the damage was done. A 6-foot section of the living room ceiling collapsed with a wet, heavy crack, dumping 10 gallons of gray water and soggy insulation directly onto the expensive gray sectional. The lifestyle brand was now literally buried in filth. Jennifer was hysterical, pacing the foyer and wailing about her clothes, her furniture, her life. Brian was huddled in the corner of the kitchen, staring at the wreckage. He looked small, diminished. The alpha male persona he'd cultivated had washed away with the sewage. "You knew," I said, walking toward Jennifer, as the dust settled. I held up the manila folder Clarence had given me, the one containing the secondary guarantor forms. "You knew Brian was underwater. You knew he was using this house as collateral for predatory loans, and you signed the papers anyway." "I didn't have a choice, Dad," she screamed, her face contorting. "We were going to lose everything. Brian said if we just got through the summer, the tech investment would come through, and we'd pay off the liens before you even noticed. We were trying to protect you by putting me in an assisted living facility in Beaverton. I pulled a stapled packet from the folder, the one I'd found in the guest room boxes earlier that morning. I found the intake forms, Jennifer. You'd already filled out the medical history. You told them I was suffering from significant cognitive decline and delusional episodes. You were planning to have me declared incompetent by the end of the month. The silence that followed was different than the one after the ceiling collapse. This one was cold, final. Even Miller and his men stopped moving, looking at my daughter with a visceral kind of disgust. "We had to," she whispered, the fire going out of her eyes. "You were becoming so difficult, Dad. You were always complaining about the money, about the noise, we thought. We thought you'd be happier somewhere where people could take care of you. Somewhere where you couldn't get in the way of our future." "Your future," I said, the words tasting like ash. "You sold your mother's dining table to pay for a deposit on a prison for your father." I looked out the front window. The rain had started a classic Portland drizzle that turned the street into a gray blur. The black Lexus was gone, already halfway to the impound lot. But it wasn't just the car. My neighbors, people I'd known for decades, were standing on their porches, watching the scene. Phil Henderson from 2 doors down was there. Betsy Morrison, who had brought me casseroles after my wife died, was standing on the sidewalk, her hand over her heart as she watched the VIP lounge furniture being hauled out to the curb by Miller's men. The humiliation was total. Every lie they had told the neighborhood, that I was sick, that they were the owners, that they were my caregivers, was evaporating in real time. "Get out," I said quietly. "Dad, it's raining." Jennifer gestured to the street. "And the house is. It's a mess. We can't leave now. Where are we supposed to go?" "I don't care," I said. I looked at Brian. "Take your lifestyle and your synergy and get off my property. Miller, if they aren't off the premises in 10 minutes, call the police and file the formal trespassing charges, and make sure the PD knows about the forgery on the Key Bank application." Brian stood up, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He realized the game was over. There were no more investors to impress, no more bridge loans to bridge the gap. He looked at the hole in the ceiling, then at me. "You're going to regret this, old man," he spat, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "You're all alone now. You think these neighbors give a damn about you. They're just watching the show. When we leave, you'll be sitting in this rotting house by yourself until your heart finally gives out. And I hope it's slow. I'd rather die alone in a house I own than live for another minute with a thief I raised," I replied. Jennifer didn't even look at me as she grabbed her designer handbag, the only thing that hadn't been touched by the water, and followed Brian out the door. I watched from the porch as they trudged down the path, their shoulders hunched against the rain. They didn't have a car. They didn't have a plan. They just had the clothes on their backs and a mountain of debt that was about to become very, very public. As the door clicked shut behind them, I leaned against the frame, my legs finally giving out. I slid down until I was sitting on the floor of my foyer, surrounded by the smell of wet plaster and the echoes of a broken family. "You okay, Mr. Bishop?" Miller asked, kneeling beside me. "I'm fine, Arthur," I said, though my chest felt like it was being squeezed by a giant hand. "Just give me a minute." I looked at the house. It was a disaster. The water had ruined the floors, the ceiling was gone, and the furniture was a total loss. But for the first time in 3 years, the air felt clean. The parasites were gone. Miller's men continued their work, systematically stripping the house of everything Brian and Jennifer had brought in. They moved with a clinical efficiency that I found strangely comforting. It was a deconstruction, a clearing of the site. Clarence arrived an hour later, stepping over a pile of ruined drywall. He didn't say a word. He just sat down on the floor next to me and handed me a fresh cup of coffee. "They're gone," I said. "I saw them at the bus stop," Clarence replied. Brian was screaming at a taxi driver who wouldn't take a credit card. Jennifer was just sitting on her suitcase, crying. "I should feel worse than I do," I admitted. "You've been carrying them for 3 years, Vernon. Your heart didn't fail because of age. It failed because it was trying to pump blood for 3 people who didn't have one of their own." He stayed with me as the sun went down. We sat in the dim light of the foyer, watching the shadows stretch across the ruined living room. Miller finished his work and left, leaving the house empty and silent. It was just me and Clarence, and the ghost of a life I used to have. But as the silence deepened, I heard a sound. It wasn't the plumbing, it wasn't the rain. It was a soft, persistent scratching coming from the wall near the stairs. I frowned, getting to my feet. "What is that?" "Rats?" Clarence asked, standing up with me. No, I said. I knew this house. That's coming from behind the wainscoting, near the old coal chute. I walked over to the wood paneling and pressed my ear against it. The scratching was frantic now. I reached down and pulled back a loose piece of molding that Brian had haphazardly nailed back into place during his modernization. Behind the wood, tucked into a hollow space in the lath and plaster, was a small, fireproof lockbox. It wasn't mine. I pulled it out. It was heavy, and it smelled of old paper and copper. I looked at the lid. There was a sticker on it, a logo for a company I didn't recognize. Northwest Asset Recovery, Disposal. Clarence, I said, my voice trembling. What is this? Only one way to find out, he said, handing me a small pry bar he'd pulled from his coat pocket. I forced the box open. Inside were stacks of cash $20 bills, mostly, bound in rubber bands. But underneath the money were dozens of envelopes. I opened the first one. It was a passport, Brian's passport. But the name inside wasn't Brian Parker. It was Brian Vance. And tucked into the back of the passport was a one-way ticket to San Jose, Costa Rica, dated for the day after the party. My son-in-law hadn't just been planning to put me in a home. He hadn't just been planning to flip the house. He had been planning to disappear, leaving Jennifer and me to face the legal and financial fallout of his crimes alone. But as I dug deeper into the box, I found something that made the cash in the passport look like petty theft. It was a ledger, a handwritten list of names, dates, and amounts. And at the top of the list, in Brian's arrogant, looping script, was a name that made my blood run cold. It was the name of the man Jennifer had been networking with all evening, the man who had been standing on my lawn, laughing over the grave of my dog. I realized then that the betrayal I'd uncovered was only the surface. Brian wasn't the mastermind. He was just the fall guy. And the person who had actually orchestrated the destruction of my life was still out there, probably watching the house right now. Vernon, Clarence whispered, looking out the window. There's a car at the curb. It's been there for 20 minutes. It's the black SUV from the party. I looked out. The headlights were off, but I could see the silhouette of a man sitting in the driver's seat. He was waiting. He's not waiting for Brian, I realized, the cold logic of a city planner snapping into place. He's waiting for the box. I looked at the ledger again. I didn't know it yet, but the names in that book were the key to a corruption scandal that reached all the way to the mayor's office, the very office I had served for 3 decades. Brian hadn't just been a failed businessman. He was a bagman, and I had just stolen his insurance policy. What happened next was the loudest sound of all. It wasn't the plumbing. It wasn't the house. It was the sound of a brick shattering my front window. The sound of shattering glass is a very specific kind of violence. It's not just noise. It's the sound of a boundary being erased. I've heard it on construction sites and in city council meetings that turned into riots. But hearing it in my own living room, the room I had just reclaimed, felt like a puncture wound to the chest. Clarence and I both hit the floor. The adrenaline hit my system like a lightning strike, and for a terrifying second, my heart skipped a beat. Then another, hammering against my ribs as if trying to find a way out. I reached into my pocket for the nitro, my fingers fumbling with the small glass vial. "Stay down, Vernon," Clarence hissed, his face pressed against the damp, gritty hardwood. Outside, a set of tires screeched, the roar of a high-performance engine echoing off the narrow houses of Ankeny Street. I waited, counting the thuds of my own pulse, until the sound faded into the distance. I sat up slowly, glass crunching under my palms. The brick lay in the center of the room, resting on the soggy, ruined gray sectional Brian had bought with my stolen equity. Wrapped around the brick with a thick rubber band was a piece of paper. Clarence reached for it, but I stopped him. "Don't. It's for me." I unwrapped the note. It wasn't typed. It was written in a clean, architectural hand, the kind of handwriting you only see from people who spend their lives looking at blueprints. "The ledger for the life, Vernon. You have until the morning. Don't make this about the girl." "Don't make this about the girl," I whispered. My stomach dropped. "Jennifer." I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the protest from my dizzy head. I grabbed my phone and dialed her number. It went straight to voicemail. I dialed again. Same result. I called Brian. The line was disconnected. "They have her," I said, looking at Clarence. "We don't know that, Vernon. Brian could have her, or she could just be out there." "No," I said, gesturing to the lockbox I was still clutching. "Brian was a bagman, Clarence. This ledger? It isn't just about debt. It's a roadmap of the last decade of zoning favors in this city. I recognize these names. These aren't just developers. These are the people I used to report to. Brian wasn't just a failed entrepreneur. He was a parasite sent to live in my house, specifically because I had the keys to the archives. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had always wondered how Jennifer, my smart, sensible Jennifer, had fallen so hard for a man like Brian. I'd blamed it on a midlife crisis, on a desire for excitement. But as I looked at the names in that ledger, I saw a pattern. Every business Brian had failed at was actually a front for a shell company involved in a city contract I had personally signed off on before my retirement. They didn't just want my house. They wanted my silence. And when I didn't die in the ICU like I was supposed to, the plan shifted from inheritance to extortion. The burner phone inside the lockbox began to vibrate. It was a frantic, tinny buzz against the metal. I picked it up. "Hello? Dad?" Jennifer's voice was a ragged, high-pitched mess of sobs. "Dad, please." "Brian. He's gone. He took the suitcase. He left me at the motel on Tamui Hind. And then these men. They came in. They said you have something of theirs. They said if you don't give it back, I'm never coming home." "Jennifer, listen to me," I said, my voice dropping into the calm, authoritative tone I used to use when a project was going off the rails. "Where are you?" "Exactly." "I don't know. It's a basement. It smells like oil and old wood." "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know about the book. I thought Brian was just—" A man's voice cut in, cold and smooth. The man in the sharp suit from the party. The one who had laughed over my dog's grave. "Enough with the dramatics, Vernon. You were always a man of logistics. Let's talk about a trade. The box for the girl. The South Waterfront Pier. Section Bone. 1 hour. If I see a police cruiser, she goes into the Willamette with a set of Brian's gym weights tied to her ankles. And believe me, Vernon, after what she signed for us, no one would even look for her. She's already a criminal on paper." The line went dead. "I'm going," I said, turning toward the door. "The hell you are." Clarence grabbed my arm. "Vernon, look at you. You're white as a sheet. You'll have another attack before you even get to the waterfront. We call the police." "I have the contact at the DA. The names in this book are the police, Clarence," I snapped, shaking him off. "The DA's brother-in-law is on page 12. The chief of police's retirement fund is on page 4. Who am I going to call? The very people who paid Brian to hide this in my walls." I looked at the lockbox. Then I looked at the ruins of my house. The hole in the ceiling, the soggy furniture, the shattered window. For 3 years, I had been a non-factor. I had been the old man in the guest room. I had been the victim. But I was also the man who had designed this city's infrastructure. I knew the South Waterfront better than the people who built it. I knew where the blind spots in the security cameras were. I knew which access tunnels were forgotten and which piers were structurally unsound. "I'm not calling the police," I said, a slow, dark heat beginning to replace the cold fear in my chest. "I'm calling the city." "The city." "Vernon, what are you talking about?" "I still have my master override key for the municipal grid, Clarence. They never revoked my senior planner credentials on the remote server because I was supposed to be a consultant after retirement. I can control every streetlight, every drawbridge, and every security gate in that sector from my laptop." I walked to the kitchen and grabbed my laptop from the counter, the one Jennifer had looked at with such contempt. "They want a lifestyle brand?" I whispered as the screen flickered to life. "I'll give them a lifestyle. I'll show them exactly what happens when you try to tear down a load-bearing wall in a man's life." I spent the next 20 minutes in a fever of keystrokes. Clarence watched in stunned silence as I bypassed 3 layers of city security. I wasn't just a planner, I was a gatekeeper. I saw the map of Section Bone of the waterfront bloom on the screen, the high-definition thermal cameras I'd had installed 5 years ago to monitor illegal dumping. There it was, the black SUV, parked behind a stack of shipping containers. I saw 2 heat signatures inside the vehicle, one in the driver's seat, one in the back, and a third signature smaller, shivering crouched in the corner of a nearby maintenance shed. "There she is," I breathed. "They have her in the pump house. How are you going to get her out, Vernon? You can't just walk in there." "I'm not going to walk in," I said. "I'm going to shut the city down." I grabbed the lockbox and my car keys. My heart was thumping, a heavy, rhythmic reminder that I was on borrowed time. But for the first time in years, I didn't care about the risk. If my heart was going to give out, it was going to happen while I was protecting the one thing I had left, even if she was the one who had helped break me. The drive to the waterfront was a blur. I didn't take the main roads. I took the service alleys and the transit lanes I knew the police didn't patrol. I parked 3 blocks away, in the shadow of an old grain silo. I opened my laptop on the passenger seat and initiated the sequence. First, I killed the streetlights in a 4-block radius. The waterfront plunged into a sudden, absolute darkness. I saw the SUV's brake lights flare on the thermal feed. They were panicking. Next, I triggered the emergency fire alarms in the adjacent warehouse. The piercing, rhythmic shriek of the sirens filled the air, a wall of sound designed to disorient and deafen. Under the cover of the darkness and the noise, I moved. I wasn't the man from the hospital anymore. I was a ghost in the machine. I knew the exact timing of the security gate cycles. I slipped through the perimeter fence just as the motor groaned to a halt. I reached the maintenance shed in 3 minutes. My chest was tight, a dull ache beginning to radiate down my left arm. I ignored it. I shoved a nitro tab under my tongue and kept moving. I found the door to the pump house. It was locked with a standard municipal padlock. I pulled out my master key, the one I'd kept in my bedside drawer for 10 years, and turned it. The door swung open. Jennifer was huddled on the floor, her white linen suit now gray with dust and tears. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror, then disbelief. "Dad, don't speak," I whispered, grabbing her arm. "We have to move. Now." We were halfway back to the fence when the lights came back on. Not the street lights, the high-intensity spotlights of the black SUV. They had realized the glitch was a diversion. The SUV roared to life, the tires spitting gravel as it spun around the shipping containers. "Over here." I pulled Jennifer behind a concrete pylon. The SUV stopped 20 feet away. The man in the suit stepped out. He was holding a suppressed pistol, the long barrel glinting in the moonlight. He didn't look like a developer anymore. He looked like an executioner. "You're smarter than you look, Vernon," he called out over the dying sirens. "But you're still just an old man in a cardiac unit. Give me the box, and maybe I'll let you die in your own bed instead of in the mud." "I don't have the box," I yelled back, my hand trembling as I reached for my laptop, which I had tucked into my jacket. "Then the girl dies." He leveled the gun. "I don't have the box," I repeated, my voice rising. "Because I already sent the digital scans of the ledger to the Oregonian, the FBI, and the Attorney General's personal email. I set it on a timed release, Elias. If I don't enter the kill code in the next 10 minutes, the entire city of Portland is going to wake up to the biggest corruption scandal in 50 years. Elias, the man in the suit, hesitated. I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You're lying. You wouldn't burn the city down. You spent your life building it." "I spent my life building a city for people, Elias. Not for vultures," I said. I stepped out from behind the pylon, holding the laptop up like a shield. "And right now, I have nothing left to lose. My house is a wreck, my daughter is a witness, and my heart is about to stop anyway. Do you really want to bet your life that I'm bluffing?" He stared at me, his finger tightening on the trigger. I felt the pressure in my chest reach a breaking point. Everything was on the line. But then, a new sound joined the night. A low, rhythmic thumping from above. A spotlight hit the SUV from the sky, a police helicopter, and behind us, the blue and red lights of a dozen cruisers began to flood the waterfront. "What did you do?" Jennifer whispered, clutching my coat. "I didn't call the police, Jennifer," I said, as the man in the suit dropped his gun and raised his hands. "I called the feds. They've been looking for that ledger for 5 years. I just told them exactly where to find the people who were holding it." As the officers swarmed the pier, I felt the strength finally leave my legs. I slumped against the concrete pylon, the laptop sliding from my lap. "Dad! Dad, look at me!" Jennifer was screaming, her face blurry as the world began to fade to gray. "I told you," I whispered, a strange, peaceful smile on my face. "I'm a city planner. I always have a contingency." The last thing I saw was the look of pure, agonizing regret on my daughter's face as she realized that her father hadn't just saved her life, he had destroyed his own to do it. What I didn't know yet was that the ledger had one more secret, a secret that would change everything I thought I knew about my late wife. The second time I woke up in a hospital bed, the humming of the machines didn't bother me. It sounded like a victory march. This wasn't the ICU of a man who had been defeated by his own family. This was the recovery room of a man who had dismantled a kingdom. But victory, I quickly learned, has a bitter aftertaste when you realize the war started long before you ever picked up a weapon. The room was quiet, filtered through the soft, gray light of a Portland dawn. I felt the familiar weight of the oxygen cannula and the tug of the heart monitor leads, but the crushing pressure in my chest had eased into a dull, manageable H. I turned my head slowly. Jennifer was there. She wasn't in the white linen suit anymore. She was wearing an oversized sweatshirt from the hospital gift shop and a pair of scrubs she must have borrowed. Her hair was a mess, and her eyes were so swollen they looked like bruises. She was sitting in the same vinyl chair Clarence had occupied, clutching a stack of papers to her chest. When she saw my eyes open, she didn't jump up or chirp a greeting. She just let out a long, shuddering breath and started to cry quietly. This time, "Dad," she whispered. "The doctors said, they said it was a miracle. You should have been gone on that pier." "I'm too stubborn to die in the mud, Jennifer," I said, my voice sounding like it had been dragged through gravel. "Where is he? Where's Elias?" "In federal custody," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "The feds, they didn't just take him. They took the mayor's chief of staff. They took 3 commissioners. They're calling it the Ankeny Sting, because of you." I closed my eyes. The Ankeny Sting. My house, my street, my life, all turned into a headline. But I didn't care about the news. I cared about the fallout. I cared about the girl sitting in front of me who had looked at me like a nuisance for 3 years. "And Brian?" I asked. Jennifer's face hardened. It was a look I recognized, the steel I'd always hoped she had in her. Brian tried to run. He was at the airport with a suitcase full of cash he'd skimmed from the last bridge loan. The feds caught him at the gate. He's being charged with everything: fraud, money laundering, and kidnapping. She swallowed hard. "He told them I went with him willingly. He's trying to take me down with him, Dad. He told the investigators that I was the one who came up with the refinancing scheme." I reached out and took her hand. Her skin was ice cold. "I have the emails, Jennifer. I have the digital trail. You aren't going down for his crimes. I'll make sure of that." "That's not the worst of it," she said, her voice trembling. She held up the papers she'd been clutching. "While you were under, Clarence came by. He brought the rest of the contents from that lockbox, the stuff you didn't have time to look at before the pier." She leaned forward, her eyes searching mine with a terrifying intensity. "Dad, did you know Mom was an archivist for the city's historical records before she got sick?" "Of course I did. She loved that job. She used to say she was the keeper of Portland's secrets." "She was," Jennifer said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She wasn't just keeping them. She was finding them. Dad, look at the dates in the ledger. Look at the payments made to the medical consultant in Haingin Le Muetam." I took the papers from her, my hands steady despite the cold dread blooming in my gut. I looked at the names. I looked at the encrypted entries. And then I saw it. Martha's name. My wife's name. Next to a series of payments to a clinic in Switzerland. "We thought the insurance covered her experimental treatments," I whispered, the memory of those final desperate months flooding back. "She told me she'd won a grant from a medical foundation." "There was no foundation, Dad," Jennifer sobbed. "The ledger shows that Elias and his group were paying for her treatments, but not because they were being kind. They were paying her to suppress the environmental reports on the South Waterfront project, the reports that showed the soil was toxic. They bought her life, and when she couldn't keep the secret anymore, when she tried to go to the papers," Jennifer pointed to the last entry, dated 2 days before Martha had her accidental fall in our home, "a payment to a man named Vance." "Vance," I breathed. "Brian Vance." The room seemed to spin. Brian hadn't just been a random suitor who swept my daughter off her feet. He wasn't a failed entrepreneur who had stumbled into my life. He was a professional. He was the son of the man they had hired to deal with my wife. He had been sent to finish the job to keep the Bishop family under control, to occupy the house where the physical evidence was hidden, and to make sure I never looked too closely at the blueprints I was signing. Brian hadn't just stolen my money. He hadn't just tried to steal my house. He had been a parasite sent to oversee the slow, methodical destruction of the man who knew too much. And Jennifer, my beautiful, naive Jennifer, had been the bait. "He groomed me, didn't he?" Jennifer asked, her voice hollow. "From that first night at the gallery, it was all a setup. He didn't love me. He was just an insurance policy." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The magnitude of the betrayal was so vast it felt like trying to map an ocean. For 3 years, I had lived with my wife's killer's son. I had fed him. I had paid his debts. I had let him mock me in my own hallways, while he sat on the secrets that had killed the woman I loved. I felt a new kind of rhythm in my chest. It wasn't the jagged skip of a failing heart. It was the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a machine coming back online. The non-factor was gone. The planner was gone. "Jennifer," I said, looking at her with a clarity that frightened her. "Go home. Get Clarence. Tell him I don't want the liquidator anymore. I want a forensic architect." "A what?" "Dad, the house is a wreck. The plumbing." "The plumbing is the least of our concerns," I said. "Brian did that bypass for a reason. He wasn't trying to move a shower head. He was trying to get into the wall cavity behind the master suite, the cavity that connects to the old coal chute. He was looking for the original hard copies of Martha's reports, the ones he hadn't found in the lockbox." I sat up, the monitor wires straining against my chest. I ripped the tape off my arm, ignoring the sting. "Dad, stop. You're not supposed to move. I've been still for too long, Jennifer. They thought I was a crumbling building they could just tear down and replace. They forgot that I'm the one who knows where the foundations are buried." The next 72 hours were a masterclass in calculated destruction. I checked myself out against medical advice, signing the waivers with a hand that didn't shake. I didn't go back to a ruined house. I went back to a command center. Clarence met me at the door. He looked 10 years older, but he had a laptop and a stack of legal filings that told me he'd been busy. Inside, the house was a skeleton. The drywall had been stripped away in the living room, exposing the Motngin Chin Chum Haimui timber frame. The smell of wet plaster was still there, but it was being replaced by the sharp, clean scent of sawdust. "The feds have the ledger, Vernon," Clarence said, stepping over a pile of debris. "But they're hitting a wall. The digital encryption is high level. They can prove the money moved, but they can't prove why without the source documents." "They're in the wall, Clarence," I said, pointing to the master suite above us. Brian was close. He was so close he literally broke the house trying to find them. He thought he was smarter than Martha. He thought she'd just shove them in a box. I walked toward the basement stairs, Jennifer following close behind. We went down into the cool, damp dark of the cellar. I walked past the old furnace, past the stacks of boxes that Miller hadn't reached, and stopped at the base of the chimney. I reached up into the flue, my fingers searching for a specific notch in the brickwork, a detail Martha had mentioned once, years ago, when we were talking about how the old Prohibition runners used to hide crates in these houses. I found the loose brick. I pulled it back. Inside wasn't a box. It was a vacuum-sealed architectural tube. I pulled it out and brought it up to the light of the kitchen. I unrolled the thick, vellum sheets. These weren't just reports. They were the original, unredacted surveys of the South Waterfront. Martha had hand-annotated them in red ink. She had mapped out every toxic deposit, every falsified soil sample, and every bribe paid to the engineering firms. But there was something else. A letter, tucked into the core of the tube. It was addressed to me. "Vernon, if you're reading this, it means the transition didn't go as planned. It means I wasn't enough to keep them away from you. They think I'm just an archivist, but I'm a bishop, and bishops protect their own. Don't just give them the truth, Vernon. Give them the bill." I looked at the blueprints. My wife hadn't just been a victim. She had been a strategist. She had known that the only way to truly stop a developer was to make the project so toxic, so legally radioactive, that no amount of money could save it. "What is it, Dad?" Jennifer asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a demolition order," I said, "for the entire South Waterfront project, and for every person who put their name on it." I turned to Clarence. "How many of these people are currently out on bail?" "Elias is out. He posted $5 million this morning. Brian is still in, but his lawyers are pushing for a medical release claiming he's having panic attacks in lockup." "Good," I said. "I want them out. I want them to think they have a chance. I want them to think the ledger is the only evidence the feds have." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to finish the project," I said. "I'm going to host one last party, but this time I'm the one sending out the invitations." The reversal began that evening. I didn't hide. I didn't stay in the hospital. I sat on my front porch, in full view of the street, and I worked. I called every contact I had left in the building trades. I called the retired inspectors, the old guard engineers, the men and women who had been pushed out by the new hustle culture of the city. By midnight, I had a crew of 20. By noon the next day, we had the South Waterfront site under a private citizen's environmental injunction. I didn't use the police. I used the labor unions. I used the people who actually built the city and who didn't like seeing their work turned into a criminal enterprise. But the real revenge was psychological. I sent a copy of the final vellum sheet, the one with Martha's red ink, to Elias's private residence. I didn't include a note. I just included a photo of the "Stay Humble, Hustle Hard" sign, shattered in my dumpster. Then, I waited. I knew how men like Elias operated. He wouldn't go to the police. He wouldn't run. He would come to the source. He would try to buy the silence he thought he'd already paid for with my wife's life. An hour later, a black sedan pulled up to the curb of C. Ankeny Street, not the SUV. A quiet, unassuming car. Elias stepped out. He looked different without his team of lawyers. He looked like a man who was starting to realize the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he'd thought. He walked up the path and stood at the bottom of the porch steps. I sat in my chair, the tube of blueprints resting across my lap. "You're a hard man to kill, Vernon," he said. "I'm a city planner, Elias. We're trained to handle structural failures. And you are the biggest failure I've ever seen. I'll give you 10 million, he said, his voice flat, for the tube and the original vellum. No more feds, no more ledgers. You take the girl, you move to Hawaii, and you live like a king for the rest of your days." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had ordered the hit on my wife, who had sent a boy to sedate my daughter and erase my life. "You're missing the point, Elias," I said. "I've already spent 30 years living like a king. I lived in a house built on honesty. I worked a job that mattered. I had a wife who was braver than any man I've ever met." I stood up, the pain in my chest gone, replaced by a cold, humming power. "I don't want your money. I want your legacy. I've already filed the paperwork to have the South Waterfront declared a Superfund site. The project is dead. Your investors are going to claw back every cent you ever stole. And by the time the feds are done with the medical consultant reports, you aren't going to be worried about bail. You're going to be worried about whether the state of Oregon still has the death penalty for corporate manslaughter." Elias reached into his jacket, his face contorting with rage. "You think I'm going down alone? I'll burn this whole block before I let you." He didn't finish the sentence, because from the shadows of the stripped living room, 3 men in windbreakers stepped out. Not Miller's men. Feds. Agent Miller, the real Agent Miller, stepped onto the porch. "Elias Vance, you're under arrest for the murder of Martha Bishop and the attempted murder of Vernon Bishop. We've been listening to the whole 10 million offer on the wire Vernon was wearing." As they led him away in handcuffs, I felt the last of the tension leave my body. I turned back to the house, the broken, hollowed-out house that was finally, truly mine again. Jennifer came out onto the porch, her eyes clear for the first time in years. She looked at the handcuffs, then at me. "It's over, isn't it?" "No," I said, looking at the sunrise over the Cascades. "The demolition is over. Now, we start the renovation." But as I looked at the empty street, I realized something. Brian was still in a cell, and Brian knew things that Elias didn't. Brian knew exactly where the rest of the money was hidden, the money that wasn't in the ledger. And Brian was about to make one last phone call. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist was already in motion. And it wasn't about the city. It was about the one person I had forgotten to protect. I thought the silence of an empty house would be a sanctuary. I thought that once the sirens faded and the handcuffs clicked shut around Elias Vance, the walls of my craftsman would finally stop whispering. For 2 days, Jennifer and I existed in a state of suspended animation. We moved through the hollowed-out rooms like survivors of a shipwreck, clearing debris, scraping away the water-damaged wallpaper, and speaking in hushed tones, as if a loud noise might bring the whole structure down on our heads. She was trying. I could see the physical toll it was taking on her, the way her hands shook when she held a crowbar, the way she jumped every time the wind caught the temporary plywood covering the shattered front window. She was mourning a life that had been a lie, and I was mourning a wife who had been a martyr. We were 2 ghosts trying to fix a haunted house. But I should have known better. In city planning, you never assume a site is clear just because the buildings are gone. You have to check the soil. You have to check the subterranean lines. And I had forgotten to check the one thing that had been right in front of me since the moment I woke up in the ICU. The call came on the 3rd night. I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking a glass of water, and looking at the vacuum-sealed tube of Martha's reports. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a restricted number. Vernon, the voice said. It was Brian, but he wasn't crying, he wasn't begging. He sounded relaxed, almost cheerful, the way he did when he was about to explain why he needed another $5,000 for a sure thing. I heard the news. Elias is in the deep end. Manslaughter is a tough charge to beat, even with his lawyers. You're going to be in the cell next to him, Brian, I said, my voice cold. The feds have the ledger. They have the vellum. It's over. Is it? Brian let out a soft, mocking chuckle that made the hair on my arms stand up. You always did love your blueprints, Big V. You think everything is a matter of structure and code. But you forgot about the most important part of any contract, the fine print, and the people who help you sign it. What are you talking about? How's your heart, Vernon? Truly. Are the meds working, or are they making you a little foggy? A little prone to suggestion? I felt a cold trickle of dread down my spine. I thought about the hospital. I thought about the nights after the attack when I was drifting in and out of a morphine-induced haze. I thought about Patricia, the kind nurse who had been there every time I woke up, the one who had always been so helpful with the paperwork. I didn't call to gloat, Vernon. I called to give you a status update. See, Elias was the muscle and the money, but I'm the one who handles the asset recovery. Did you really think I'd put all my eggs in a lockbox behind a piece of wainscoting? That was the bait. I knew you'd find it. I knew you'd go to the feds. The ledger is real, Brian. The corruption is real. Oh, it's very real. And while the feds are busy chasing Elias in the mayor's office, they aren't looking at the small stuff. Like the Bishop family revocable trust that was filed 4 days ago while you were still in your hospital bed. The one that grants full power of attorney to a third-party administrator in the event of your cardiac-related cognitive decline. I gripped the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. I never signed a trust, Brian. Actually, you did. Patricia is very good at her job. She's my cousin, by the way. She's also a licensed notary. You signed it right between your second dose of beta blockers and your afternoon nap. You thought you were signing a consent form for a new stress test. But what you actually signed was the deed to the house, the rights to your pension, and the title to every investment account Martha left behind. The room seemed to tilt. My scarred, tired heart gave a violent, sickening thump. And here's the kicker, Vernon, Brian continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The administrator isn't me. It isn't Jennifer. It's a shell company based in the Cayman Islands, and that company just sold the property at S.E. Ankeny Street to a private developer for $1. The eviction notice should be arriving in about 10 minutes. The sound of a heavy vehicle pulling up to the curb echoed through the quiet house. I looked through the kitchen window. It wasn't a police car. It wasn't the feds. It was a white sedan with a corporate logo on the door, Ironclad Property Management. I'm going to leave you now, Vernon, Brian said. I've got a deal of my own to sign with the DA. Turns out, if I provide the testimony that nails Elias for Martha's fall, they're willing to look the other way on the minor civil matters regarding your estate. I'll be out in 5 years. You, on the other hand, will be exactly where you belong, on the street, with nothing but your blueprints. The line went dead. I stood there, paralyzed, as a man in a tactical vest stepped out of the white sedan. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying a staple gun and a stack of orange notices. Dad, what's happening? Jennifer was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fresh terror. I couldn't answer her. I watched as the man walked up my path and stapled an orange poster to the plywood on my front window. Notice of immediate seizure. Property deemed unsafe for habitation. Unauthorized personnel will be prosecuted. The front door opened. The man didn't knock. He had a key. My key. Mr. Bishop, the man asked. He was young, professional, and entirely indifferent to the wreckage of my life. My name is Greg. I'm with Ironclad. We've been instructed by the new owners to secure the premises immediately. You and your daughter have 15 minutes to gather your personal effects. Anything left behind will be hauled to a landfill by sunrise. This is a mistake, Jennifer yelled, stepping forward. My father owns this house. He's lived here for 20 years. The record shows a transfer of title on the 14th, Greg said, checking a tablet. Signed, notarized, and filed with the county. It's a legal sale. If you have a dispute, you'll have to take it up with the holding company's lawyers in Georgetown. But for now, you're trespassing. I looked at the man. I looked at the orange notice. I looked at Jennifer, who was crumbling again, her face dissolving into a mess of panic and guilt. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sensation that wasn't rage or fear. It was total, absolute exhaustion. I had fought the city. I had fought the mob. I had fought my own body. And in the end, a nurse with a clipboard and a cousin with a grudge had taken it all with a flick of a pen. "We're leaving," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "Dad, no, we can't. We have to call Clarence." "Clarence can't help us with this tonight, Jennifer," I said. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed the architectural tube. It was the only thing I took. No clothes, no photos, no memories, just the evidence that had cost me my life. "We're leaving because if we stay, we'll be in a cell by midnight, and I can't finish this from the inside." The walk down the path was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The neighbors were back on their porches. Phil Henderson looked away. Betsy Morrison was crying. They had watched the lifestyle brand fall, and now they were watching the man they'd known for 20 years be tossed out like a bag of trash. I walked to my Subaru, which was still parked at the curb. I put the tube in the back seat and waited for Jennifer to climb in. She was sobbing, clutching a single shoebox of her own belongings. We drove away as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the house on S.E. Ankeny Street in the rearview mirror. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a home. I had $600 in my wallet and a heart that was ticking like a time bomb. We ended up at a Motel Saw on the outskirts of the city, a place where the air smelled of cigarettes and old carpet. I sat on the edge of the bed, the architectural tube resting on my lap, while Jennifer paced the small room. "I'm sorry, Dad," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I brought him here. I let him in." "It wasn't just you, Jennifer," I said. "He was designed for us. He knew our weaknesses before we even knew him." I opened the tube. I looked at Martha's red ink. And then I saw something I hadn't noticed before. On the very edge of the South Waterfront Survey, tucked under a legend for a sewage line, was a small, hand-drawn symbol, a circle with a cross through it. It was the symbol for a benchmark elevation, a surveyor's tool. But next to it, Martha had written a series of numbers that didn't correspond to any elevation I knew. 45,52, 122,68. Coordinates. I pulled out my phone and typed them into a map. The blue dot landed right in the center of downtown Portland, right in the middle of the Pioneer Courthouse Square. "What is it?" Jennifer asked, leaning over my shoulder. "It's a safe deposit box," I whispered. "But not at a bank." Martha didn't trust banks. She was a historian, Jennifer. She knew where the city kept its most valuable records, the ones they didn't want in the digital system. I looked at my watch. It was Chin, hum p.m. The courthouse square would be quiet, but the underground archives, the ones used by the city's historical society, stayed open until midnight for researchers. "We have to go," I said. "Dad, you're exhausted. Your heart." "My heart is fine, Jennifer. It's finally beating for the right reason." We drove back into the city, the neon lights of Portland blurring into a smear of color through the windshield. I felt a strange sense of weightlessness. I had lost the house. I had lost the pension. I had lost the reputation. I had nothing left to protect, which meant I was finally free to be as dangerous as I needed to be. We reached the square. The brick-lined plaza was nearly empty, the fountain a low, rhythmic hum in the background. We walked to the entrance of the Historical Society, a quiet, marble-lined building on the edge of the square. The woman at the desk was old, older than me, with spectacles that made her eyes look like giant, inquisitive orbs. She looked at my disheveled clothes, at Jennifer's tear-stained face, and then at the architectural tube. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm Vernon Bishop," I said. "I'm here to access the Martha Bishop Memorial Collection, Box Bay Chumlea Bone." The woman's expression shifted. She didn't look at my clothes anymore. She looked at me with a profound, quiet recognition. "Martha told me you might come someday, Mr. Bishop. She said if you did, it would mean the city was in trouble." She led us back into the stacks, deep into the climate-controlled belly of the building. She stopped at a small, gray metal box. She didn't ask for ID. She didn't ask for a signature. She just handed me the key. I opened the box. Inside was a single, leather-bound journal, and a small, silver thumb drive. I opened the journal to the first page. It wasn't a diary. It was a confession. But it wasn't Martha's confession. It was Clarence's. "Vernon, if you are reading this, it means I failed you. It means my daughter's life was more important to me than your friendship. Brian didn't just target you. He targeted Sarah. He's had her in a lifestyle debt trap for 5 years. I did what I had to do to keep her out of prison. I'm the one who gave Brian the keys to your workshop. I'm the one who told him about the lockbox. I am the rot in the foundation. I felt the world go silent. My best friend, my only ally, the man who had sat on my porch and drank my whiskey while helping me plan my own destruction. But as I turned the page, the real shock hit me. But Martha knew. She caught me. She gave me a choice. Help her protect you, or she'd burn my firm to the ground. We built a second contingency, Vernon. A demolition plan for Brian and Elias that they never saw coming. The holding company that just bought your house? It isn't Brian's. It isn't the Cayman Islands. It's ours. I looked at the thumb drive. I realized then that the eviction wasn't a defeat. It was the final phase of the plan. Martha and Clarence had built a trap so deep, so complex, that Brian had walked right into it, thinking he was the one pulling the strings. The orange notice on my window wasn't an eviction. It was a shield. "Dad, what does it say?" Jennifer asked. I looked at her, and then I looked at the dark windows of the city hall across the street. "It says that the house is safe, Jennifer," I whispered. "And it says that Brian just handed us the evidence we need to put every single one of them in a cage for the rest of their lives. But we have to move fast, because Brian doesn't know he's been caught yet. He thinks he's won." I stood up, the journal tucked under my arm, but as we turned to leave the archives, the heavy, reinforced door of the vault slammed shut. The lights flickered and died. And from the intercom on the wall, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 3 years, a voice I thought was long dead. "Hello, Vernon," the voice said. It wasn't Brian. It wasn't Elias. It was the woman I had spent my life trying to protect. The woman who had supposedly died in a fall 3 years ago. "Martha?" I gasped, my heart stopping for real this time. "The city is a messy place, Vernon." Her voice crackled over the speakers, cold and devoid of the warmth I remembered. "Sometimes, you have to burn the whole blueprint and start from scratch, and you were always too soft to do what was necessary." I realized then that the person I had forgotten to protect was me, from my own wife. The silence that followed Martha's voice was absolute. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a tomb that had just been unsealed. I stood in the pitch-black center of the vault, my hand frozen on the leather journal, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Jennifer was gasping beside me, her fingers digging into the meat of my arm so hard I knew she'd leave bruises. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking into a million jagged pieces. "Mom, is that really you?" The lights didn't flicker back on. Instead, a single, high-intensity emergency lantern on the far wall hummed to life, casting long, distorted shadows across the rows of archival boxes. A figure stepped out from behind the heavy steel shelving of the 14th century land deeds. She was wearing a dark trench coat, her hair once a vibrant chestnut, now a stark, elegant silver. She looked older, thinner, and her eyes held a cold, tactical light I had never seen during our 30 years of marriage. Martha, my Martha, the woman I had buried 3 years ago, the woman whose accidental fall had been the catalyst for my own slow decay. "The fall was real, Vernon," she said, her voice echoing off the marble walls. She didn't move toward us. She stood like a sentinel, watching us with a clinical detachment. But the death was a necessity. I knew about the soil reports. I knew about Elias. I knew that as long as I was alive and breathing, they would keep coming for you. They would keep using me as leverage to make you sign those falsified zoning permits. "You let me bury an empty casket, Martha." I found my voice, and it sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone far away and very, very angry. "I spent a year in a daze of grief. I almost followed you into that ground. And Jennifer, you let your daughter think she was an orphan." "I didn't have a choice," Martha said, and for a fleeting second, the mask slipped, and I saw a glimmer of the woman I loved. "If you knew I was alive, you would have been a terrible liar, Vernon. You're a builder, not a spy. You would have looked for me. You would have led them straight to the archives. I needed you to be broken so that the world would look away while I dismantled them from the shadows." "And Brian?" Jennifer asked, stepping forward into the light. Her face was a mask of horror and dawning realization. "Did you choose him for me, Mom? Did you set me up with a predator just to keep an eye on Dad?" Martha looked at our daughter, and her expression softened into something that resembled pity. "I didn't choose him, Jennifer, but I didn't stop him. I saw him approaching you at the gallery that night, and I realized he was my best opportunity. I knew he was Elias's bagman. I knew that if he moved into the house, he would eventually lead me to the ledger. I used your heart to save your father's legacy. It's the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I felt a wave of nausea. The lifestyle brand, the synergy, the 3 years of psychological torture, it hadn't just been Brian's greed. It had been Martha's long game. She had allowed a wolf into our home to keep the lions at bay. You're just as bad as they are, I whispered. I'm the one who ensured the house was safe, Vernon, she snapped, the silver-haired stranger returning. The holding company that evicted you tonight? I own it. I bought the debt Sarah Adams ran up. I used Clarence to feed Brian exactly enough information to keep him busy while I prepped the federal case. The orange notice on the window? It wasn't to throw you out. It was to keep the local police, the ones Elias pays for, from entering the premises while the feds moved in. Suddenly, the heavy vault door groaned. It didn't just open, it was forced. The hydraulic hiss of the mechanism screamed in the quiet archives. Brian stepped through the threshold. He wasn't in handcuffs. He wasn't in a cell. He was disheveled, his expensive polo shirt stained with sweat, and he was holding a service pistol he must have taken from a guard. He looked at Martha, then at me, then at the journal in my hand. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, the look of a man who had finally realized he was the smallest fish in a very dangerous pond. The feds, they're everywhere, Brian panted, the gun shaking in his hand. They're at the airport, they're at the motel, but they aren't here, not yet. He looked at Martha with a mixture of terror and awe. You're the one. Elias told me there was a ghost in the system. He said someone was leaking the internal memos before he could even send them. I taught you everything you know about city secrets, Brian, Martha said, her voice calm and level. Too bad I didn't teach you how to read a room. You're holding a gun in a room full of federal witnesses. Do you really think this ends with you walking away? I'm not walking away with nothing, Brian screamed. He pointed the gun at Jennifer. The holding company, the Cayman Shell. I know it's you, Martha. I saw the signatures on the notary override. You're going to transfer the property back to me. You're going to give me the keys to the asset accounts, or I'm going to make sure Vernon actually becomes a widower tonight. I didn't think. I didn't wait for my heart to skip. I stepped in front of Jennifer. It's over, Brian, I said. I held up the thumb drive from the box. Everything you want is on here. The codes, the transfers, the evidence of the shell companies. But you have to let her go. Give it to me. I tossed the drive toward the shadows near the old furnace vent. Brian's eyes followed the silver arc of the plastic. It was the only opening I needed. I didn't lunge for the gun. I reached for the emergency fire suppression lever on the wall, a detail I'd personally insisted on when I consulted for the Historical Society's renovation in Hangin Lea Muihai. I pulled it. The vault didn't fill with water. It filled with halon gas, a heavy, colorless suppressant that displaces oxygen to put out fires without damaging the paper. It's effective, it's fast, and if you aren't prepared for it, it feels like the air has turned into lead. Brian gasped, his lungs suddenly empty. He dropped the gun, clawing at his throat. I grabbed Jennifer and shoved her into the small, reinforced ventilation closet, the safe zone for the archivists. Martha was already there, pulling us inside and slamming the airtight door, just as the vault turned into a silent, airless vacuum. We watched through the small, reinforced glass window. Brian slumped to the floor, his face turning a terrifying shade of blue. He didn't die. The system is designed to knock you out, not kill you, but he was incapacitated in seconds. 10 minutes later, the feds arrived. Agent Miller, the real one, led the team. They wore oxygen masks as they dragged Brian's limp body out of the vault. They didn't look at me. They looked at Martha. You're officially a ghost again, Mrs. Bishop, Miller said, removing his mask. The paperwork for your resurrection is being processed, but the DA is going to have a lot of questions about the 3 years you spent off the grid. I'll answer them, Martha said, her voice weary. But first, I'm going home. The walk out of the courthouse square was different than the walk in. The city felt smaller. The high-rises I'd helped approve looked like cages. The streets I'd mapped looked like a labyrinth we'd finally escaped. We drove back to S.E. Ankeny Street in silence. The white sedan from Ironclad was gone. The orange notice was still on the window, but the front door was unlocked. We walked inside. The house was a wreck, the hole in the ceiling, the ruins of the lifestyle furniture, the smell of wet drywall. But as the sun began to rise over the Laurelhurst trees, the light hit the timber frame of the living room. It looked like the ribs of a great, ancient ship. Martha walked to the center of the room and touched the exposed wood. I'm sorry, Vernon. I'm sorry I let them break the house. The house can be fixed, Martha, I said. I looked at Jennifer, who was standing by the window, watching the neighborhood wake up. She looked older, her face etched with the weight of secrets she should never have had to carry. But I don't know if we can. We're bishops, Martha said, her voice finally carrying a trace of the woman I remembered. We rebuild, we follow the code, and we make sure the foundation is solid. The months that followed weren't a montage of happy reunions. They were a slow, painful restoration. Martha had to face the legal fallout of her fake death, a process that involved a year of supervised probation and the total forfeiture of her city pension. Jennifer went into intensive therapy, finally divorcing Brian and starting a small architectural salvage business. She didn't want the lifestyle anymore. She wanted things that were old, honest, and built to last. As for Brian, he's serving 20 years in a federal penitentiary in Sheridan. Elias Vance is right there with him. They'll never see the South Waterfront project finished. In fact, no one will. I used my final consulting leverage to have the entire site converted into a protected urban wetland. The toxic soil will stay buried under 6 feet of clean fill and native plants. A park for the people, built on the ruins of a conspiracy. I'm sitting on my porch now. It's a Saturday in late September, exactly 1 year since the night in the vault. The house on Essie Ankeny is finished. I did the work myself this time. I replaced the Italian marble with local butcher block. I rebuilt the mahogany dining table from the scraps I found at the Hawthorne boutique, and I finished the bookshelf in the workshop. Martha is inside, reading the morning paper. We don't talk about the 3 years much. We talk about the garden. We talk about the traffic. We talk about the city. Jennifer pulled up to the curb a few minutes ago. She's carrying a box of pastries and a set of blueprints for her new shop. She walks up the path, her gait steady and purposeful. She doesn't look like the girl in the graduation gown anymore. She looks like a woman who knows exactly how much her life is worth. Hey, Dad, she says, sitting down on the steps next to me. Hey, honey, how's the shop? Solid, she says, smiling. We found a set of original Mutngin Jincham door handles for a restoration in the Pearl. They're beautiful, Dad. You should come see them. I'd like that. I look at my neighborhood. Phil Henderson is walking his dog. Betsy Morrison is pruning her roses. The world is continuing, indifferent to the structural failures and the grand demolitions that happen behind closed doors. I've learned a lot about cities over the last 4 decades. I've learned that you can't protect a building from the elements forever. The rain will eventually find a leak. The termites will eventually find the wood. The ground will eventually shift. But I've also learned that a house isn't the wood or the brick or the Italian marble. A house is the stories we tell inside it. It's the honesty of the joints. It's the resilience of the people who refuse to let it fall. My heart is steady now. It doesn't hum like a machine. It beats like a drum. I'm a city planner, and I know that every demolition is just an opportunity for a better design. We had to burn the whole blueprint to find the truth. But as I look at my daughter and I hear my wife's voice from the kitchen, I realize that for the first time in my life, I'm not looking at a plan. I'm just living in the structure. And finally, the code is perfect.